Hello everyone, my name is Matthias. So last weekend I had a conversation with a buddy of mine and we were pretty much discussing setting up a server at home. So using it as an NAS or running a few services like cloud storage or hosting a website. The only issue this person was facing at the moment was that they didn't really know where to start. So they had a bit of information, they had a bit of knowledge about the hardware side, how to set everything up, but they didn't really know how to get started, how to make these things work with each other. So that was a bit of a block for them to get actually started with this. So I thought to myself, well, why not make a quick mini course about this? Because I think many people at the moment rely on big tech companies when it comes to their data, personal files, and of course other services. And I'm not really a big fan of that. So I don't really like third parties. I don't want to rely on any of them actually. If I can, I would like to host these things myself and have full control over it. So I pretty much recommend any tech-savvy individual to have a look at Homelabbing. So what is Homelabbing? Well, as I mentioned, pretty much a server for your home. Of course, the topic itself is a bit wider than that, but for now I'm just going to have a look at just running a server at home. Now when people think about servers, they often imagine like a huge supercomputer or a server rack filled with multiple devices. But the truth, of course, is that you can pretty much start with something as little as a Raspberry Pi or an old laptop. Now for this mini course, I am going to use a general desktop tower computer as an example. The reason being, well, it is a lot more flexible than just running things on Raspberry Pis or an old laptop, of course. Okay, so before we get started, a small disclaimer, of course. I am just an enthusiast, so please don't quote me too much if I make any obvious mistakes or I say something wrong, of course. I haven't really made too much notes. I've made this presentation, that's about it. But after these 3 slides, we will just get right into it and set everything up. My main aim pretty much is to explain this to the general public, so to everyone. That's maybe also why I might omit some information about things just to keep everyone on track and, well, so that everyone actually understand. If I use too many different terms that people don't understand, well, I don't think that that will be useful for the general public. Okay, so what are we going to look at? Well, first of all, the desktop hardware that we're going to use. Things that I recommend, so if you don't already have a device or you're still shopping for something, we'll have a look at the hardware that I recommend. Then what software we're going to use, so the operating system. As you can see from the logos, maybe you already know these. We are going to use Proxmox and TrueNAS primarily. And then also we're going to have a quick look at the services that we can run. So these are services that I recommend that you use. You of course don't need to, but for the general public these are already pretty useful. So let's get started with the hardware then. There we go. So for hardware, well, if you don't already have a device and you're still shopping, have a look at the processor that you're going to use. If you are planning on running multiple services at the same time, so let's say a gaming computer, an instance of like your own cloud storage, a website, and maybe other things as well, you might need a few cores to actually run these things. Reason being, well, we are going to use a operating system called Proxmox, which creates virtual machines. So that means that we are able to create multiple computers within our one server or our one computer itself. And because these computers also need like specific processor, you need to actually provision specific cores to these multiple virtual computers. And the more you have, the better, of course, because the more processor cores you have, the more virtual machines we can create. Another thing is the RAM, so the work memory. Again, the more you have, the better. With the processor cores, we can actually over provision what we have. So that means that if, let's say, I have a processor with 8 cores and I have 2 virtual machines, I can give each virtual machine, let's say, 4 cores. If I then have I need an extra virtual machine, I can give it more than these 8 cores that exist. So we can use specific cores for multiple virtual machines. The problem with RAM is that this is not possible. So if I have, let's say, 8 gigabytes of RAM and I've already given 4 to one virtual machine and 4 gigabytes to another, I pretty much used all my RAM. And if you're then going to over provision, that is only going to cause issues. So that's something that you need to keep in mind, that you still have enough RAM for that. Then for the RAM itself, if you're going to go shopping for that, well, one thing to maybe keep in mind, and maybe something that is very useful, is ECC RAM, so error correction code RAM. Reason being, well, they can actually fix issues when accessing files. So let's say you have a lot of photos that are very important to you, or documents that are very important to you. If you are going to access these files often, they will be loaded into RAM to actually use it. But whilst it is in RAM, there can be some issues, so corruption or a bit flip. So these things don't often happen, like I think once a year or so is the general consensus. And often you don't even notice that these errors occur. But of course, over the years, this can add up. And we don't really want to lose any data, so that's where ECC RAM comes in. They can actually detect these errors and they can fix it. Of course, not every motherboard supports ECC RAM, so if you're going to purchase a motherboard, check that it supports it. You will also need to enable this. No, I'm not sure. I don't think you need to enable this within the BIOS, but it might be possible for some manufacturers. But do check that they are compatible, of course. If your motherboard is not compatible, your ECC RAM will be just normal RAM, so you've spent maybe more money for the same stick as non-ECC RAM. Now, which type do you need to purchase? Because when you're going to look for these sticks, there are specific categories for them. And there are 2 types that are often used. One is unbuffered RAM and the other is registered. Now, if you're just purchasing or going to purchase like consumer hardware, often it is the unbuffered RAM that you need to purchase. If you are going to actually purchase like enterprise hardware, like a super micro computer or anything from the servers from Dell or something, they pretty much all, I believe, only support registered RAM. So that's something to keep in mind and have a look at. Now, an extra layer of protection is that your CPU also can work in conjunction with the RAM, of course, to make it extra safe, of course, so there's no data corruption or data loss. Now, for the CPU itself, well, for AMD, it is the Ryzen and EPYC processors that support this. And I believe for Ryzen, it is not official, but it should still work. So even though it's not in any manuals from Ryzen, the ECC should work without any issues. Now, for Intel, at the moment, I believe only the Xeon processors support ECC, and maybe also now the latest generation of Intel processors, so Gen 12, I believe it is at the moment. That should also now support this, but of course, do check for yourself in the specs of the processor itself if it is supported. Then, a few other things to maybe keep in mind. If you are planning on using your home server as a NAS, so network attached storage, you might need multiple hard drives or multiple SSDs to keep all your data stored. So do check when you're purchasing like a power supply or a motherboard that it has enough connectors for these specific devices. So for the power supply, so the PSU, it is a SATA 12, or is it 15? I'm not sure. 12 or 15 15 pin power connector. So have a look at that. Pretty much all of them come with like at least 3 or 4 connectors. But if you have more hard drives, do check that you have enough slots, of course, or enough connectors. And for the motherboard, do check that you have enough slots, so SATA connectors, to actually plug these in so you can actually access them. Now for the storage itself, I recommend that you purchase hard drives that are made for being, well, that are NAS specific, so that they are made to run 24/7. They are a bit more robust. They are made to run 24/7 and also to run very close to other hard drives, so spinning disks. They often like have a little vibration, and this can over the long term cause issues. But with NAS specific drives, they are a bit better built, so that shouldn't be an issue then. Now if your motherboard doesn't have enough SATA connectors, an alternative is to get a SAS HBA card, flash to IT mode. I'm not really going to go in too much detail, so if you're interested in it, do your own research for that. Another option is of course to just purchase like an expansion card for within your PCIe slot with SATA connectors on them. That's also an alternative. Then for the motherboard itself, there are a few things that you need to look for, and also a few things that we might need to enable within the BIOS of the motherboard itself. So one thing that the motherboard needs to support, and something that pretty much I believe every processor should now support, is virtualization. So since we are going to use Proxmox as our OS or operating system, we are going to create virtual machines, and to create them we of course need to enable virtualization. Within the motherboard BIOS, we need to enable for Intel processors, Intel VTD, and if it's an older processor, I believe it's VTI or VTX. And then for AMD, it is either called SVM for the new ones, I believe, and for the older chips, the older processors, it's AMD VI. So do check that your motherboard allows you to change this within the BIOS, and that your processor, of course, has this virtualization feature. Now to get into the BIOS, I think most of you will already know, but if you don't, when you boot up your computer and there isn't an OS installed, or at the very start, it will like show you a logo from a manufacturer. This is the logo of your motherboard manufacturer, and it will then tell you to press a specific key on your keyboard to get either in the BIOS or in the boot menu, I believe. So you need to then press, what is it, like F12 or delete or F9, depending on your manufacturer. Press that, and then in the settings from your BIOS you can enable this. Another thing or another feature that your motherboard needs to have and that you need to enable within the BIOS is a IOMMU group pass-through option. So what this does, well, it allows you to actually pass through specific parts from your motherboard to a virtual machine. Now why is this useful? Well, let's say we want a virtual gaming computer, so we want to pass through a video card. We can, because with IOMMU group pass-through, these things can then be assigned to a virtual machine, and that's pretty useful, of course. Also for our NAS, we are going to use TrueNAS. I'll come to that in a minute. The most reliable option is to pass through the SATA controller on the motherboard to TrueNAS. So something to keep in mind and to have on your motherboard as a feature. A few other quality of life settings you might want to change. The first one is power on AC. So let's say the power goes out at your home. Of course, all the electric devices shut off. With power on AC, the computer will detect when the electricity is back, and it will boot itself up again, which is pretty useful because if you want to run a server, it's of course pretty important that they run always 24/7. So if you don't want to check every time the power goes out if it is running or not, just enable power on IC, and every time the electricity comes back, it will boot up on its own. Now, if you are purchasing hardware from like a company, which is like secondhand or something, do check also that the built-in SATA controller of your motherboard is not set to RAID mode, because we don't really want hardware RAID. We are going to set up TrueNAS for our storage or data storage, and that is software RAID, which means we don't really need it within hardware. It will only cause issues. I believe it won't even work. So disable any RAID, like for example RAID 1 or RAID 2 or RAID 10 or RAID 5. These things, disable that so we can actually set up TrueNAS in this case. Okay, so for the storage, the software, first of all, we are going to, as I mentioned, install Proxmox, which is a hypervisor to install the virtual machines on. One of these virtual machines will be a network attached storage OS, so a NAS OS, which is called TrueNAS. In this mini course, I'm going to install TrueNAS Scale. And this is for our hard drives, so we can create like a pool where we can store all our data on and then share it on our local network at home, so any computer can actually use it. And then a few services that we are going to actually have a look at and maybe also set up are Portainer. Portainer is pretty much used for Docker. So if you don't know what Docker is, well, Docker is pretty useful. It like runs services within a container, so it won't affect anything on the computer itself, so it doesn't have any interference. So there's a little, less likely chance that something goes wrong. And Docker is pretty much only run via the command line. But with Portainer, we actually have a useful web interface, and I'll show an example of it when we come to this specific thing, these services. It's a very useful web interface to actually manage all our Docker containers, and all these services will be running in a Docker container. So the next one is Pile. Pile will be used for ad blocking, so having an ad blocker on your network at home is pretty useful. And we're also going to use it as a local DNS. So what is a local DNS? Let's say you want to serve to google.com. Of course, that is just the name of the web link. There's an IP address behind this. And so we don't really need to remember these IP addresses. This is all done for us. And when we are going to run these services, let's say Portainer or Nginx Proxy Manager, they will all have their own IP address. And if we don't want to remember these, we can actually set up a local DNS and give them a URL that we can easily serve to. Wireguard is a VPN, so that's pretty useful, so we can actually access our home network from anywhere within the world. So it's then also very useful to manage our server from anywhere around the world. Nginx Proxy Manager will also be used for our local DNS, so it's very easy to navigate to specific ports. Also, if you want to make things available on the internet, so let's say a website or something, it's a lot safer to only have to open 2 ports on our modem and our router. So yeah, that's a pretty useful one. Then I also would like to see Nextcloud with either Collabora or OnlyOffice. So that's an alternative to, let's say, OneDrive or Google Drive. So here we are going to store our documents, and we can then also manage these with OnlyOffice, so we can edit them on via a website. So that's very useful, of course. And then also just Nginx, which we are going to use as a normal, to set up a normal website and make it available on the internet. Okay, let's get started then, shall we? So the first thing you might want to do is go to Proxmox. So you can just go to Google and search for Proxmox. Then in proxmox.com, we can go to download. And here we have the ISO for Proxmox VE, so the virtual environment, I believe it stands for. And you will need to actually, well, burn, I believe is the term, I'm not sure, or just install this ISO on a bootable hard drive or a thumb drive, like a USB stick. And what you can use for this as well, something like Rufus if you're on Windows. So Rufus, yes, so that's pretty straightforward. So you just download the ISO and then start it from here. Well, I'm not running on Windows at the moment, so yeah, this is not really something that will work. For another option is Etcher, Balena, I guess it is called. Yes. So that's another option to actually use. And well, if you're running Linux or something, you can always just use DD. But I guess people who use that will know what I'm talking about. Okay. Then, after you've, of course, installed it on your bootable disk, you can just plug this in to any USB port on your computer, boot it up, and then when you get again the logo from the motherboard manufacturer, instead of going to the BIOS, we go start the boot menu will also be one of the F keys or delete or something, and then we boot into the USB or like a what is it called, like a portable hard drive or something. You can use these as well. And if you have a monitor installed or connected to the desktop itself, you should see something like this popping up. Now do keep in mind, if you're using a processor that I mentioned here, so like a Ryzen processor or EPYC or Xeon, these three will not have like integrated graphics. So if you like connected your display cable or your HDMI cable to the motherboard and then to your monitor, you might not get any input or output in this case. Reason being, of course, they can't show any video. So you might want to temporarily then also install a video card and connect it like that to the display itself. Afterwards, if you don't want to use that video card after the installation, you can always unplug it and run the server headless. That's no problem. We're going to manage it via a website, so it's just something we need to do for now during the installation. So once you've done that, we can actually press enter and start the installation. And this shouldn't take too long. There we go. So, of course, the user license agreement, we agree. Now, Proxmox does a great job with explaining everything what we need to do. I'm not going to go into too much detail. I'm just going to show you what I select here. So here it will detect all the hard drives that are connected to the desktop. I want to choose VDA1 in this case, but I also have a few other hard drives here, as you can see, and these will be used for our data storage and that we are going to use within TrueNAS. But for now, I'm going to use this 64 gigabyte VDA. Next, I need to choose my country. Time zone is correct. Keyboard also. Let's set a password. So this will also be the password that is used in the web interface to actually manage Proxmox. So do remember this. And then the email, I'm just going to use a dummy email in this case, because I'm not planning on using it, because it's of course in a virtual machine for me. .com. Now this email address, as it mentions here, it is just used for sending important alerts and notifications. So I guess it won't be used for like marketing ends. Next. Then do have a look that the correct network interface, so the Ethernet port here is the correct one that is being used. Do of course select the one that is now connected to the internet at the moment. Then for the host name, the node from Proxmox itself, so you can have multiple hosts nodes within Proxmox, but the host name in this case will be the first word, so in this case PVE, and then we have like a domain name. So if I call this pve.mydomain, which is a dummy, there we go, then our node will be called PVE. If you want to name this something else, or if you have multiple nodes, you can call it like PVE 1, or if you already have 1, 2, and so on. I'll just keep it at PVE. And then we set the IP address. This will also be the IP address from the web interface. So just something easy to remember for me is 2. And then the gateway and DNS is fine. So let's click next. This looks good. There we go. And then the installation will start. This will pretty much depend on how quick your network speed is. If you are using like USB 3 or USB 2 to install this, so that pretty much all depends. But it shouldn't take too long. I guess like 5 to 10 minutes. For me, it should be a bit quicker since everything is local here. Now while we wait on this, you can already open a new tab and go to HTTPS, and then we can go to, let's have a look, 192.168.122.2, and here it is already. We are going to use port 8006. Press enter. It doesn't load anything, but that's of course normal because the installation is still going on. So we're at 73%, so we'll just have to wait a bit longer. And once this is done, our web interface should load. Now that's for creating virtual machines. One of the virtual machines that we are going to of course create is TrueNAS. And for TrueNAS you can just surf to TrueNAS.com, and this is pretty much used for our storage. So to actually get the ISO so we can install it, you can go to get TrueNAS, and well, here you can choose which one you prefer. If you don't know which does what, have a look at yourself on the internet what each one does. Core is like an older version. It should still be supported, but there are less features in my opinion. Scale can also be used like standalone, so you don't really need Proxmox. You can also just install TrueNAS bare metal, and it should also like support creating virtual machines and running services themselves. But that's not. I don't really like the flexibility that is available within TrueNAS to create these services and these virtual machines. I personally believe that Proxmox has a lot more features in that case. You can change a lot more, but it is a nice interface to actually manage your data. So that's why I use TrueNAS. So we'll just go for TrueNAS scale, and then here at the bottom I have already signed up. And then here we have, of course, the download button to get the ISO itself. Okay, so you can already get that. Of course, do it on your own computer, so not the one that is now being, the installation is being done on. So that's this one. Apparently, it already rebooted. There we go. So after the installation is done, it will automatically, of course, reboot. And in this case, it already has done so. And it tells us that Proxmox is at the moment running on 192.168.122.2 and on port 8006. So that's the link that I already had given here. So let's just refresh. And now we just get a warning. And it tells us, okay, there's an issue. Let's see. We'll learn more well, it doesn't really matter. If I go advanced, here is also a bit more information. So it tells us a unknown issuer. That's fine. We are using like HTTPS to have an encrypted connection, but since it's a unknown issuer from the certificate, I guess it will give this issue. We can just accept and continue. We are hosting this on our own, so we can actually trust this. For anyone who is using like a Chromium browser, I believe you can press on something like learn more or another link, and then it will also give like this pop-up and you can just enter the website. So yeah, here we have the web interface from Proxmox. I can already give my password because I used that or set that up during the installation. Now for the username, this is always the same. You can always, if you want to, create a new user for this, but by default it is root. So let's log in. And the first thing we get is a message about a no valid subscription. So Proxmox itself provides like a repository for enterprise, but since we are just going to use this for home, we don't really need this, so I can just safely say OK. And I do want to actually update this enterprise repository that we don't want to use it. If we don't do this, it might cause issues and we won't get any updates. So how can I check if I can get updates or not? So I can go here at the top, so left top. We are now in the data center, so here we can see a lot of information about our setup. If I go to the node, so PVE, we get even more information. So this is for this node specific. If you have multiple nodes like PVE1, PVE2, these will populate here as well. And if I go to the shell, I can actually check if I can get updates. So Proxmox uses Debian. Well, it is pretty much built on Debian. So we use the apt package manager. So if I do apt update, it might error out because we don't have the enterprise. So there it is. So at the moment it says fail to fetch from enterprise, meaning we won't be able to actually get any updates. So I believe Proxmox itself has like a cron job or something that runs in the background that updates every so often. But because we still have this enterprise repository, we need to remove this to actually receive updates. So let's do that. So within Node, we go to repositories. And here we can see the enterprise repository. So let's disable that one. The only issue now is that we still do not receive any updates from Proxmox because we just removed this one. We will get like the security updates at the moment, but nothing from Proxmox. We need to add a new repository. That's fine. And instead of Proxmox, we are going to use the no subscription repository. Let's add this. There we go. And now everything should be fine. Let's quickly check. Let's do another apt update. And now it shouldn't error out. So as you can see, it uses now the repository for the PVE no subscriptions, and we got no error. And it tells me that there are any updates, so let's upgrade. 400 megabytes, so that is going to take a while. So we'll just leave this in the background for now, and I'll just explain a bit more about all these available settings here. So if we go to disks, here we can see all the disks that are connected to the server at the moment. So I have VDA. This is the one I chose to actually install Proxmox on, as you can see here. We have a few partitions, and maybe the most important one is this LVM. The LVM partition is 68 gigabytes, and it is split in two. You can't see it here, but we actually use this as two separate storage options. And when I click on this drop down here for next to PVE, as you can see, we have a local and a local LVM. So that's both these are within VDA 3, but they are split up. The reason being, well, if we have a look at local, this is pretty much used, so the content of local are backup files, ISO images, and container templates. So if we're going to back up a virtual machine, they will be stored here. The ISO images are of course used to install a virtual machine, and then the container templates are to install containers. Now, what are the differences between both? I'll come to that in a minute. Now for local LVM, it's pretty much in the name, it is for VMs. So the content for local LVM is disk images and containers. So these will be stored separately in this case. Okay, hopefully the update is done in the background so we can actually get started with creating a VM. Before we do, maybe a few other things to note. Well, let's quickly have a look at what's something else that might be useful to know. Nothing at the moment actually. Maybe I'll come back to the Acme certificate if I have enough time. Okay, so to create a VM, at the top here you can see create VM, but we also have an option to create a CT, so a container. Now what's the difference? Well, if you have like a very strong and powerful computer, you can pretty much always use just a VM. And of course with a VM it has its own kernel, its own systems, everything is within that VM to run the computer itself. With a container it's a bit different, so containers are more used if you have less space or if you want to make efficient use of your space. So what a container will do, it will also containerize like your applications that you will run, but it will actually share the kernel with Proxmox, so the host system in this case. This means that you will need less space. It will also use less resources like your processor power or your RAM. So that's something very useful to do. In my opinion, even with a strong computer, only like use VMs if you really need to. So for example with TrueNAS, of course, we can't really use a container for that. I believe at least it doesn't exist. But if you can containerize, it is recommended that you do so. For example, like a Linux distribution, often they have like templates for these. I'll show them also in a few minutes, and it's a lot more efficient in my opinion. So to actually create one, so if I press create VM, I can of course give it a name and an ID, and if I have multiple nodes, I can of course select the node. Let's just give this a temporary name at the moment. And then it here asks me to actually give an ISO. Now we can't really upload an ISO here. We first need to do this in storage. So let's just exit out of this first. Let's go to local, because this is where we store ISOs. So here we have a tab ISO images, and I can actually upload one. From here I can select a file, and let's pick TrueNAS. Okay, and just press upload, and depending on how good your internal network is, it will actually be either quick or a bit slower, but I guess most home networks will have like a gigabit speeds. Task OK, so that's uploaded. And now we can actually create a VM. Now for the containers, I'll just also quickly show that here. If you already have a template, you can upload it, or you can, well, if you have a URL for a template, you can also just do it like that. But there are also already available templates within Proxmox here. As you can see, as I mentioned, let's say you want something like Debian. Yeah, we have Debian 10. I think there should be, yeah, here's a Debian 11. So there are also a lot of templates here. These are not all the templates. So let me just quickly go back to PVE shell. And what was it? I guess it was PVEAM update, I believe. I'm not really sure. Yes, okay. And then we go back. And if I now go to templates and scroll down, as you can see, now there are also turnkey templates here. So these are specifically made as containerized applications set up by turnkey. So if you wanted to set something up like GitLab and host it yourself, this will pretty much come with everything set up out of the box. So as I mentioned in the start of the mini course with the slides, we're going to host all these things within Docker. If you don't want to like use all these things, these come pretty much set up from the get-go with a specific service themselves. So there are a lot of things here. So OwnCloud, Moodle. So there's a lot, like a WordPress even. So very easy to then create a website. Wireguard, which we will also set up. So yeah, so you can also download these as well. Let's quickly already download like a Debian one, or I believe I can't. I do have to check first. I do believe I need to show these containers on my own personal instance of Proxmox that I'm actually running at home, because I don't think that these containers work within my virtual machine for this mini course. But we'll just download it for the sake of it. Okay, let's create that VM then, shall we? Create VM. VM ID is fine. Let's call it TrueNAS. And then I also have these advanced options. If you don't see these, do select here advanced at the bottom. And I do want TrueNAS to actually boot up at the start. Let's say the power goes out and we have set up in the BIOS of our computer to boot power on AC. That's all fine. The problem is all the virtual machines won't boot up on their own. So you need to actually set that up here to actually boot at the start when the computer boots up, so the server. I can give it a order, so in this case 1. So the first thing to actually start up. Now if you have more, so let's say a startup order 2 or 3 and so on. If I start this up as number 1 and I have a virtual machine that, for example, depends on TrueNAS, I can tell TrueNAS to actually wait, let's say 60 seconds after this one starts before boot order 2 actually starts up. So let's say I have a Ubuntu virtual machine that needs to start 60 seconds after TrueNAS. This is pretty much how you set it up. But since we're not going to do that, I'm going to remove it. Next, I have uploaded the ISO now. There we go. And the guest OS, of course, is Linux. If you are like planning on using Windows or something, do select the correct one here. This is all fine. Next. I don't really need to change anything here. Maybe enable QEMU agent. This is pretty useful. It is pretty much a helper for virtual machines. I believe a lot of distros actually come with this already enabled. So if you have like a Linux VM, it probably already has it, but just to make sure, just enable it. This will also cause less issues if you plan on actually like shutting down the virtual machines within this web interface instead of actually having to go into the virtual machine and manually shutting everything down. So that's pretty useful in my opinion. Next. So from here we are going to create a virtual disk to actually save everything on. So we had the 64 gigabyte hard drive where we installed Proxmox. It gave, what was it, like 58 gigabytes as normal storage, and for local LVM like 40 gigabytes I believe. So we have space for that here. If you have of course additional drives that you want to use, you can of course add them as I have shown like a minute ago with storage, but I'll show it in a minute again. So 32 is fine. If you don't have enough, not a lot of space, you can always enable discard. So if we don't have discard enabled, it will actually create like a QCOW image, which is like a file with everything from VM within it, and it will provision that 32 gigabytes. Now, if you don't have that much space, we can always click discard, and then it will grow the file along with how much we actually use. So if we don't use 32 gigabytes at the get-go, let's say only 16 gigabytes, the file will only be 16 gigabytes instead of 32. So that's pretty useful in my opinion. But for now, I'll just leave it as default. If it's an SSD that we're using, very useful to actually enable SSD emulation. And that's pretty much it for here. If you're planning on running this virtual machine not within like local LVM, but in another storage location that is, let's say, an SMB share, so a local network storage location, it is maybe recommended to set async IO from IO uring to native all threads. I believe this is a bug, but I'm not sure, but it can actually cause errors or the system to actually fully hang or shut down the virtual machine, I believe. So do change it then to native or threads. We'll see how to actually use like an SMB during this mini course as well to store your local virtual machines. Okay, next, CPU. I only have one CPU, but you can, of course, like give it a specific type here to actually simulate a specific CPU within the virtual machine. I only have one CPU, but if you want to if you have like two CPUs, you can always give it two CPUs here with one core each, but I only have one, and I am going to give this 4 cores. Next. For TrueNAS, I recommend at least 8 gigabytes. The reason being, well, it uses a lot of RAM, TrueNAS. It will actually store specific files within RAM that you access often. So that's pretty useful because RAM is very quick, even quicker than most of the SSDs. So if you like access specific files very often, it will be very snappy. From any computer on the local network actually, so that's pretty useful in my opinion. Ballooning will be set to off, so that won't make it so that it can use more than the 8 gigabytes. Next, network. This should all be fine. I'm not really going to go into networking because this is more advanced. Next, and that's all fine. So let's confirm. It is now a lock here, so there we go, and that's done. So it can take a while depending on what you're actually using, but once you get the ID, like a gray display, or yeah, a gray display here, and then the name behind it, it should be done. From here we get also like a new menu where we can manage everything. So with hardware we can have a look what is all here. With options we can change a few things as well, and there are of course a few other options here as well. If we go to console, we can actually start the virtual machine, but at the top here, as you can see, we have start and we have console. So that's maybe more useful in my opinion. So if we click on console here, it will open like a new window where we can start the virtual machine. So we don't really need to run it like very tiny within the web interface. So let's start this up. Press enter. And this shouldn't take too long. There we go. So enter. And this is our virtual disk that we just created. Enter. And here it tells us, okay, it's going to fully erase everything and create new partitions, so on and so on. Yes, we want to do this. Let's create a password. So this installation is even more straightforward than Proxmox, because we only need to allow one thing and then set a password, and then it will start doing all these things on their own. So we'll just have to wait for this. This is going to do what it needs to do. So let's move this over. Now, if you wanted to use another storage location other than local LVM, what we could do is actually go to data center, storage, no, I'm wrong, I believe. It was the node PVE disks. And here we could like initialize a disk with GPT, and then we can actually use this as a storage location as well. If we don't want to actually use TrueNAS, there is also an option within Proxmox to set up like ZFS. So that's to create like this data pool to actually be able to access it on the network. That's also an option within Proxmox. So with ZFS here, we can create ZFS and then select all the disks and select RAID level here. So I'm not going to go into too much detail at the moment because I'll explain this when we're setting up TrueNAS. But just know that you don't need TrueNAS to set this up and all your data. But personally, this is something that Proxmox is not really good for, in my opinion. TrueNAS has a lot of features in this case. Okay, something else maybe? No, that's pretty much everything. Let's have a look here at the installation. Yeah, it's at 90%, so it shouldn't take too much longer. And then we can actually have a look at that. So TrueNAS works pretty much the same as Proxmox. So if I go to 192.168.122 dot, and then it should give me an IP after the installation is done, because TrueNAS also uses like a web interface to manage everything, which is pretty useful because we don't really need to access or sit down next to the server to actually manage all these things. We can do it from any computer within the local networks, which is of course pretty useful. So let's wait a bit longer and we should get an IP in a minute. There it is. So it asks us to reboot. So let's do that. And the first time I believe that you start up TrueNAS, it takes a bit longer. I guess because it needs to set a few things up before we can actually use everything. So let's wait for that. Now while we wait on this, it's maybe useful to actually have a look at how we're going to pass through all these disks to our virtual machine itself, because I'll show that in a sec. It will not actually detect the drives that are connected to our computer because the disks are not passed through. So as I mentioned at the start of the mini course with the IOMMU group Passthrough, that's something very useful, because if we go to our virtual machine and then hardware, we could actually just add a new PCI device, and then we could go down here and add a SATA controller. So that would be very useful to do. But as you can see here, it tells me this is not possible, so we can't really do that. But if you have this enabled, you can just select SATA controller, enable all functions, and that should all work. But one more thing that we need to do for that is actually change a few settings within Proxmox itself to actually allow the IOMMU grouping actually. Now before we do that, let's quickly go to our web interface. So that's at 85. It gives us again a warning, so we can now move this over because we don't longer need this, we only just need the IP. There we go. And then from here, again a warning, probably the same warning with a unknown issuer or a self-assigned certificate. So yeah, that's pretty much the same. So we'll just accept. And then here it is pretty much the same as with Proxmox. We already gave the password during the installation, and the default username is root. Login. and here we have everything. So the CPU detects the 4 cores, so that's working. It also sees the 8 gigabytes, and if you have ECC memory, it will also tell you here that it is active and actually working, so that's pretty neat. And for now, it is only using very little actual RAM, but the more you will use, this will probably like fill up to almost 70%, 80% at times with the cache actually. So yeah, just keep that in mind. Don't be alarmed if you see like a high RAM usage. This is all just files that are within RAM. TrueNAS will know that if you need this RAM, it will just all get rid of it very quickly, so you won't even see any performance issues actually. So if I go to storage now, because we want to actually use TrueNAS to set up our storage or data pool for our home. So let's go to storage and create a pool. It doesn't actually see the disks here, so we need to pass these through. So to do so, let's go back to PVE. So Proxmox. Let's go to the shell, and we first want to actually, I'll show it here. I can't really do this with the PCI device, but I'll just set it up here. So for the people who are able to do this, you can follow along here. The first thing we are going to actually do is have a look at the, what is it called? It's yeah, let me quickly first, now I think about it, actually get, oops, what am I thinking? First get a text editor. There we go. Now I can actually edit a specific file to allow this IOMMU group pass through. So we do that in etc default and then grub, so that's the grub configuration file. There we go. And we are going to edit this one. So grub command line Linux default. It is now set to quiet. And we need to add one more argument. And it is not like that. It's like this. Yeah. So AMD underscore IOMMU, not IOMO, MMU equals on. Of course, this is for the people that have a processor from AMD. If you have a processor from Intel, change this to Intel underscore IOMMU equals on. So that's pretty much needed to actually enable this within grub. That's not the only thing. So this is just that grub knows that this needs to be on. We also need to enable these kernel modules within Proxmox to actually be able to do this. So let's write and quit. We are going to update the grub configuration, so the image. So this will generate a new image and will be used on the next boot. So we do need to restart the virtual machine before we can actually do this. But before we actually do, let's also add a few kernel modules. So that's an etc modules. And then from here we are going to add VFIO. And I need to think that I don't make any mistakes. IOMMU, VFIO underscore IOMMU. No, this one is type 1, I believe. And then we have PCI and VFIO underscore VerQFD. So these are the 4 that you need to add. So VFIO underscore IOMMU underscore type 1. VFIO underscore PCI and VFIO VerQFD. Write and quit. We don't need to update anything here. This will all change whenever we reboot. And then one more thing. This is for the people that actually want to pass through a video card. So if you don't have a video card, you don't need to do this. But for those that do, we need to actually blacklist the drivers for these within Proxmox. So when Proxmox boots up, it doesn't want to grab these devices and actually use them. So to do that, we go to mobprobe. So etc mobprobe d pve-blacklist.conf. And at the moment there's already one in here, which is NVIDIA FD. but we also want to blacklist just normal NVIDIA. We want to blacklist Radeon, which is from AMD for the AMD video cards. But if you're using AMD or NVIDIA, it doesn't really matter, just blacklist all of them. And then we have one more, and that's the open source drivers for NVIDIA, which is Nouveau. So these all need to be added here, and right quit that as well. So now for all of you that have changed these things and want to pass through like a SATA controller or video card, it is recommended that you now reboot, and then we'll go on and actually pass everything through. So for TrueNAS, you can then go to Add, PCI device, select your SATA controller where all the hard drives are connected to, and we can give it all functions. That's pretty much it. I can't really do it, as you can see here, so I'm not going to do it this way. For people who can't, this is how you will do it. It is not recommended. I personally recommend to like use a what's it called, a SATA PCI controller or something like that. PCI SATA controller, or like the SAS HPA card that I mentioned before, that is flash to IT mode. But if you can't do all these things, we need to do it manually. It can sometimes cause issues, but well, I've never experienced anything, but it is not the recommended way, but I'll just show it how you can do this. So the first thing we need to do is actually have a look at what's it called again? It is LN L, I believe, dev disk by ID. I'm not 100% sure. Oh no, of course, ls. So LSL dev disk by ID, and here we can see all the disks that are actually connected to the server at the moment. So the first one here is a DVD-ROM, not the one we're looking for. PVE root, also not. PVE swap, this is all where Proxmox is installed on, not these partitions either. This is our virtual machine, TrueNAS, also not the one. These also not. But as you can see here, we have 4 disks, and these are the 4 that we are looking for. So you have to have a look as well yourself which disks you are actually wanting to pass through to TrueNAS. So in this case, I've gave them a very easy name to remember and to write down. If you have actual hard drives, of course, these are just virtual hard drives for the mini course. If you have actual hard drives, they might have a longer string or longer name that you need to remember. Do write them down correct or copy paste them, it doesn't really matter, but do write them down correctly when we're going to pass them through, because if the name is not correct, it will just give an error. So how can we pass these through? Well, there's a bit of information that we first need. So if we go to TrueNAS and go to hardware, as you can see, there is already one hard disk connected, which is the virtual one, the one where everything is running on from TrueNAS. And this one is called SCSI 0. So the first one is called 0. So if we're going to add extra disks, they will need to be ID SCSI 1, SCSI 2, SCSI 3, and so on. So that's something to keep in mind. Another thing that we need to know is the ID of the VM. As you can see here, it's VM 100. Also can tell it from here at the top. So these are the 2 things that we need to know. So let's go back to the shell from PVE. And we need to set or say QM set, and then the virtual machine ID. So in this case, it's 100 dash SCSI. And well, 0 already exists, so SCSI 1, next one, and then /dev /disk /by ID, and then the name of the disk itself. So if I remember correctly, it was virt.io disk 1 in my case. And if I press enter, it will update the VM and will actually pass through the disk. So if we go to TrueNAS, and on the hardware, we now have a SCSI1, which is disk 1, and it also detects the size, so we are sure that it is actually passed through. So we need to do that 3 more times in my case. So virt.io disk 2, and we also need to change the ID from SCSI1 to SCSI2. Disk 3, SCSI3, and disk 4, SCSI4. If we now go back to hardware, they're all here, so they should all be detected. So let's go back to the web interface for TrueNAS. Let's go reload storage and create a pool. And now, as you can see here, all the 4 disks are connected or are detected. So let's give this pool a name. So this is the whole data pool that we're going to set up. I'll just call it vault. That's my default name. And then from here we can select these disks, move them over to data VDEVs, and now we can choose how we want to set these up. So at the moment it is, well, suggesting RAID Z2, and with say RAID Z2 it estimates a raw capacity of 36 gigabytes. So that's about 40 gigabytes. So that means that we have 2 disks worth of data, and the other 2 disks will be used as redundancy. If we need more, we can always change this to RAID C. So in this case we have 54 gigabytes, so around 60 gigabytes. So now we are using 3 disks and 1 disk for redundancy. And by redundancy I mean, let's say we are using these disks for multiple years and one of them is having some issues and it fails. We can be sure that our data is still safe because it is either all here or all on SDB, CD. It doesn't really matter. If one fails, all our data is still here. If 2 disks fails, well, pretty much all our data is gone or corrupted, so we don't really want that. So if you want to, this is personal preference how you want to set it up and how safe you want to be. For me, I always recommend RAID C. If you have like 3 to 4 disks, if you have more, it may be more useful to have more redundancy, of course. Another option to actually keep these things separate is to use something like a mirror. So with mirror, that's for 4 disks in this case very safe because we only have 18 gigabytes. So 1 disk worth of capacity, but it will be stored 4 times. So a copy on every single disk, meaning we can lose, well, 3 of them before we actually lose something. The very useful thing about the mirror is that we can actually read from this disk 4 times as fast, because if we load something up, all these 4 disks can spin up and read the same thing at the same time, which of course will be a lot quicker. Writing of course will be just the same speed because we need to write it to all of them at the same time. If we want some more space, so let's say I am very intrigued with the mirror, but I don't want to lose this much data, we can always create multiple VDEVs. So in this case we only have 18 gigabytes. If I move 2 of these back over, I still have 1 disk of redundancy because, well, it's just a mirror. And if I press repeat the drive, we now have 2 VDEVs, each with its own mirror, of course, which with a backup actually. So we will still be able to like read from these disks at double the speed because there are of course 2 copies, but we of course now have more capacity. So we have now, as you can see here, 36 gigabytes available, so actually double. So that's also something to think about, but in my opinion something like RAID C1 is fine, especially for 4 disks. So let's create this, confirm, create pool, and this shouldn't take too long. Now if you are very interested in how all these things work with RAID C1 and so on, I do recommend that you read up on it on your own. I'm not going to go into too much more detail or waste time on that too much. If you're not sure, something like RAID Z1 or RAID Z2 or maybe even RAID Z3, if you have a lot of disks, is also an option, of course. There we go. And now our storage is created. So it tells me around 50 gigabytes. So that will be around 55, 60 gigabytes in total that we can actually use. Now this is just our pool. So our pool is called Vault, but we still can't really use it at the moment. So how can we make this useful? Well, we need to actually create a dataset. So this is actually a folder within our file system where we can actually store our data. So let's create that data set. Let's call it data. And we don't really need to change anything here. I'm also not going to go into the advanced options. There we go. And now we have actually a file where we can save all our data. Now at the moment, if we view the permissions, this data set is owned by root, which we don't really want because, well, I think most of you will run your computer not as a super user. So we do need to change this to a new owner. So how can we do this? Well, we can go to credentials, local users, and then we can just create a new user. So let's close this, add, let's give it a name, let's set a password. Okay, that all looks fine. We don't really need to set a group because, well, it will always create a group with the same name as our username. You also don't really need to set up a directory or a home directory for this user. It's not really needed if we're just going to store data on it, and we'll just allow sudo so we can actually run some commands as this user if we are going to use it as a login as well. Looks good. Save. So we now have our user here. That's all looking good. Let's go back to storage and our dataset here. On the three dots, view permissions, and press the pen icon. And here we can use a drop down to go all the way down to the new user, which is me. And then for the group itself, we can also go all the way down to me. Of course, if you have multiple users and you want to give this a general group name, you can always do that. You can also, under credentials, create new groups if you want to. So that's pretty useful. I want to apply these and maybe also allow write for the group. We'll set this to recursive. So if you already have data or folders in there and you want to quickly change the owner from all this data, you can actually do this recursively with all the existing data as well. Continue. And then also if you have child data sets created, you can also apply the ownership on these as well to the new owners. So that's pretty useful. Let's save. So what is a child data set? So as you can maybe remember, here in Vault I created a data set, but we can actually do the same with this data set as well. So we can actually nest these into each other. Okay, so this should be now owned by me. So if I now on my own computer here, so my home computer, open my file browser and actually try to access this. So before we can actually do this, let's move this over. We might actually need to make it available to the network. So to do this, we can go to shares. And in general, I recommend most people to just use the SMB shares. It is universal. It can be used on Linux, macOS, Windows. So that's something recommended. For NFS, that's more for Unix. So Linux and something, and the rest you don't really need if you're not that knowledgeable about it. So just use the Windows SMB. Let's select the path, in this case data. The SMB share now has the name data. That's fine by default. If you want to change it, you can do that here. And that's all looking good. So let's save. We do still need to enable the service. There we go. And now if I go to my file browser and actually go to this location, this will depend of course on your computer and how to connect to SMB shares. I'm not going to explain this, just look it up if you don't know. But if I now give the IP of TrueNAS, so 192.168.122.85, and then the name of the SMB that we set up, so in this case data, I am able to actually log in. So my user is already correct and the password is in this case what I set up for this user. Connect, and there we have it. So we are now connected. I can create a folder, so a new folder is in here just to check and make sure that it actually works. Let's go to the shell within TrueNAS. Let's go to what was it, MNT vault data, and I do an ls. Here you can see new, so it is actually in here, so that works without any issues. Okay. Next up, so let's remove this now quickly. Delete, yes. Let's unmount. Okay. If you want to use this SMB share actually within Proxmox, we can. So let's go back to Proxmox, and if I go to data center, we're already on storage, so go to storage, press add, and from here we can use an SMB/sif. The ID doesn't really matter. It is called data, the SMB, so I'll keep it with data. Server is 192.168.0.122.85. My username and password. Whoops, that's wrong. There we go. And it should now search on its own and it finds the data share, so we can actually add it. And once this is done and initialized, we can actually use it to set things up. Now at the moment it only allows for disk images. Now if I press edit, I can actually select a few other things. So if I want to also store ISO images or container templates or backups or containers, we can pretty much select all of these and it will create the correct folders within the SMB share, so we can actually save all these things. So that should all be fine. So here it is. I also have all the options, so I can actually upload an ISO and such. Now, as I mentioned before, if you want to use like an SMB and you're running a virtual machine, I'll just give this a dummy quickly. And you, let's say, so in here, I don't have any ISOs on data. So it selects this by default, but we don't have it. So let's quickly go to local and then next. Here we go. So if we are planning on actually storing our data or a virtual machine on data, that is fine. But I do recommend that you then actually change here async IO from IO uring to native or to threads. So that's what I mentioned before. I think it's a bug, I'm not really sure, but it might cause issues for you. So if you experience like errors or your virtual machine hanging, maybe change these things. Of course, have a look. You don't really need to create a new virtual machine for this. You can just go to, where is it, like hardware, then select like the hard drive, and then you can change it here as well. So you don't need to then delete everything again if you notice halfway through an installation, for example. Okay. Then for maybe something useful for TrueNAS before I forget. So you can actually also create virtual machines and services that you want to run within TrueNAS. So you don't really need to use Proxmox. So if you're not following along but just having a look at this mini course and thinking about what you can actually do on your own, you can also just install TrueNAS on bare metal, so you don't need Proxmox. And then from here you can go to virtualization and create virtual machines if you actually need to do this. If you're not planning on doing so, you can also go to apps, view catalog. In this case I need to create actually a pool for this, so we'll select Vault, and it will create a data set where everything will be stored. So TrueNAS Scale, not TrueNAS Core, so if you've chosen TrueNAS Core, won't, I believe, have this. But TrueNAS Scale also allows you to very quickly and easily set up these services. We are going to use Docker, and I'll show that in a few minutes. But if you're not that handy with these things, it is something that TrueNAS can do as well. So it will create the data set. So if I go to storage again, there's now an IX application data set where everything will be stored for the applications. That's these. Now there are, in this case, like 4, 8, 12, 16, so 16 apps, but there are a lot more. I have written this down somewhere. Let me have a quick look. Yeah, so if you want more than these, there is something called TrueShots. Here we go. And here it actually tells you, okay, how can I set this up? And then you'll have a lot more options. So let's do this quickly. So TrueNAS Scale. I don't know this by heart my own. So what do I need to do? Go to the apps. That's what I've done. Catalogs. No. Manage catalogs. Add catalog. Continue. Call it TrueShots, and the repository is apparently this. It needs to be stable in main, so let's save that. And that should pretty much be everything, apparently. So I guess it will actually add these in the background. We'll come back to this in a minute. Now if we go back to Proxmox, one thing maybe also of note is if you want to change these things, so options can pretty much all be changed on the fly whilst the VM is running. Hardware you really can't, so if I now change this to, let's say, 10 gigabytes of RAM, I can change it, but it will be orange, meaning, well, it will only take effect after we reboot the virtual machine. So keep these things in mind while you set everything up. I'll just set it back to normal. If you want to back up virtual machines, there is an option, of course, with backup. You can click backup now. And then here we have where we want to save this, so data either or local. Let's keep it data, and then we can set the mode. So by default it's snapshot. This means that you won't have any downtime, so the virtual machine can keep running while the snapshot is being made. You can use that then to recover everything. Another option is to suspend and stop. These are a more safe way of actually backing everything up without any issues, but I believe there is some downtime with these two. Okay, and then you can just, when this one is created, you can select that one and then press restore, and set everything up again if you made any mistakes during a virtual machine installation, for example. So is this done already? No, it is still taking a bit. We'll come back to this in a minute. Oh, it's done apparently. Okay, let's close. No, it's not done yet. So I thought so. So normally after this thing at the top here, so this is what I'm waiting for, actually, this notification to be gone, and then it should populate these as well. Now while we wait, I might give an example of creating a container. Now for the container, I'm actually going to move to my own instance. So this is my own instance of Proxmox. So that's actually running on a device at home here with me. I am not going to set a container up here because apparently containers don't work when I'm running Proxmox within Virt Manager. So yeah, I'll do it just here. So let's create a container. Now, by the way, again, if you can't remember, under local CT templates, you can actually select a template that you want to use. At the moment, I already have a Debian 11 template here, so I don't really need to do anything here. And as I mentioned, containers are very lightweight. So if we compare actually a template versus a ISO image, well, the ISO for Debian here is 397 megabytes, which is very light because I believe Debian pulls everything from the internet. But the container itself here from Debian 11 is only 123 megabytes, so it's a lot less. And it will also take no time to actually create a container. So let's create one here. So create container. PVE is fine. Let's give it an ID. So I give my containers an ID of at least 200, so 205. Let's just say tutorial. And then a password. So this is the password that will be used to actually log into the container itself. The login is again the same as you use for Proxmox. So in this case, I'm still using just the root login. Not sure if it's too safe to do so, but I don't really care, honestly. So it will be then root and then this password that you give over here. Then there's an option of either a privileged or a unprivileged container. So the thing is, as I mentioned, these containers, these LXC containers, run on the kernel of the host system, so Proxmox. That works all fine, but of course, due to security and everything, they are by default set up as unprivileged, meaning that not everything will work out of the box. Now, if you have if you're using these containers and you're getting like these weird errors that it can't access a specific file or a specific directory, it is often just because it's not a privileged container. So by default, I would always keep this as unprivileged, but when I'm like doing things, for example, like trying to connect an SMB share, like the one we set up on TrueNAS, we might need actually a privileged container. So then we need to go back and actually make it a privileged one. And I'll show that in a minute how you need to do that afterwards. But I'll keep it unprivileged. And then nesting is pretty much the option to use a container within a container. So what I mean by that is, well, we are creating a container. The container is, in this case, Debian. And within Debian, we are also creating a container, which will be like our services. So Docker with Portainer. So the things that I explained here. So these things, Portainer, Pile, Wireguard, we will use these within a container. So let's go here. Let's keep nesting on. Next. Do keep in mind if you by default deselect unprivileged, as you can see, nesting will be grayed out, but it will be checked, but it won't be actually when you boot up the system. So if you're like installing a container unprivileged and you're trying to install Docker on it, well, it might give issues and you think, well, why nesting is enabled? Well, it will not be when you deselect this. So we'll just keep it selected for now. Next. Let's select Debian. Next. I'll keep it at local LVM. These containers don't really need a lot of gigabytes of storage. This will of course depend on what services you want to run on them. But for the services that I use or I use here, most of them won't use this that much. Maybe like Nextcloud will use a bit more than 8 gigabytes, but pretty much no more than 16 gigabytes, I believe, with OnlyOffice. Let me quickly check here with my setup. Can I copy this link? Yes. So that's clouds. Yeah, so my Nextcloud instance here is running with 16 gigabytes and it's only using like 10 gigabytes and it has a lot more actually on it. So yeah. this one. So let's keep it at 8. Next. 1 core for this example is fine. 500 megabytes is also fine. So as you can see, these numbers are a lot lower than a virtual machine because they share a lot with Proxmox itself, with the host. Next. We'll keep it at DHCP. If you want to set a static IP address, don't forget, of course, the subnet mask. So 192.168.0. Let's say 60. It will not allow this. We still need to say /24, let's say. And then we need to give the gateway, so 192.168.0.1, for example. But for now, we'll remove this and actually just use DHCP because that's a bit easier then. Next, DNS is fine, same as host. And that's also fine. So let's finish. And now the installation for a container is done. That's it. So that's the difference between a virtual machine and the container. Our installation for the container is actually done. I can go to 205 tutorial, console, start it up, and there we are, done. So root, my password that I set up, and I'm in. So from here I can actually start installing Docker. Before we do this, actually, because, well, Docker will be needed to install our services, let's quickly go back to TrueNAS. Is this done already? So it's still valid. So apparently these true charts can take a while if it doesn't have a lot of resources, apparently. But it is taking a while. I'm not sure why. It should be the correct link, so yeah. Yeah, it's not here yet. That's a bummer. We'll come back to this. Okay. So for installing Docker, what I recommend, because we are now using, what's it called, Debian, we can just say apt update, just to be sure that everything is up to date. Fine. Apt upgrade. That's just a small update, not too much. And I believe the apt package manager itself, if you of course choose another distribution template, that's all fine by me. I don't really care what you use. But if you are planning on using Docker, of course, use the commands that are relevant to your distribution. So for me, I can probably say apt install Docker or Dockerd or Docker compose. I'm not sure. That's one option. Personally, I prefer actually going through adding the official repository from Docker. And to do so, let's see, Docker engine install Debian, I guess. Yeah. So I pretty much follow these steps. And the useful thing about actually using a container compared to a VM is that we can actually just copy paste in the terminal. So that's so much easier to actually run commands. And this is not installed yet, so that's fine. We can actually go and install these packages. Yes. So that's pretty much what you can do as well. Just look for the same address and then just follow along. I'm not really reading this because I've done this multiple times, but you can follow along. Since we are logged in as root, it is maybe recommended to remove sudo because we don't have it and we don't need it. Let's copy this one. Let's remove tree or sudo and then just t. Let's just do this apt update. And now that the repository is added, I can just install Docker. Yes. That's pretty much all we need to do, actually. There we go. Then the next thing is to actually install what's it called, Portainer. So Portainer is the first thing that we were going to actually install. Maybe also the Portainer agent. All these things are again just on a you can easily find these things just on the internet. It's not you don't need to be a genius to just find this actually. So let's say Portainer installation Docker. Yeah. So first link, probably the correct one. Yes. So how do we deploy Docker Portainer within Docker? We first need to create a volume. So just copy paste. So I'm not going to do this because I already have Portainer set up, and because probably, or we'll do this. Doesn't really matter. Let's copy, paste, and add that D. And then this one, copy, paste, enter. And this will pull the latest image, or in this case, image 2.9.3 as a version. And this is done. So since it's Docker run, it will probably already be running in the background. So how can we now know where this is running? Well, let's just do an IP A. And then in here, it will tell us the IP address of the virtual machine. In this case, it is this one. So 192.168.0.203. And Docker is running within either port 8000 or 9443. And I'm pretty sure for the web interface they use 9443. 8000 is, I believe, for the agent. So let's try 9443. That's the correct one, but it tells us that we need to use HTTPS to be safe. So let's do that. HTTPS. Again, the warning, but since we're hosting this on our own, should all be fine. And here we have Portainer. We can actually now go ahead and pick a password. So what password are we going to pick? Doesn't really matter. Let's change the username as well, just if we need to actually log in during this whole process. Looks fine. No thank you. There we go. And let's get started. So we'll just start fresh. And this one will be called local. So if I open this, there's at the moment one thing running. And as you can see, it is Portainer itself. So we are now going to actually use this to set up all our services. So let me just move this over to this one. Let's shut this down. There we go. Now, primarily I prefer using a stack. Reason being, well, it's a lot easier to set everything up, and we can actually use Docker Compose, which is very useful for the future if you want to always set things up the same way. Now for that I have created a few boilerplates on my GitHub, and I'll also link all these in the description. Docker. Yeah, so here they are. In this case we are going to install a few things. So where am I looking? So for now, well, we'll do this over here. Okay, never mind. So let's go to Portainer, add stack. Let's give the stack a name. So we'll just call this one pile because that's the first thing that we will set up as a service. So this will be used for ad blocking and for your local DNS. So what we do is go to my boilerplate for pile. And these are called like Docker Compose files. So as you can see here, this is what I've set up. And this here is what we're going to copy. So we're just going to copy and paste. And what this actually tells us, well, first of all, is how is this set up. In this case, it uses Docker Compose version 3. We will create a service called pile. And for that, we are going to pull an image from Docker Hub, and that will be called Pi-hole. and we are going to use the latest tag. So that's the version. In this case, we'll just always want the latest version. The container is also just called Pi-hole, and we set it up as restart unless stopped. So it will, even when there are errors, it will always try to restart unless we actually manually stop it. In this example, we are also setting up a network, and this network will be used for Wireguard. So this is pretty useful. Wireguard will be our VPN. That's the next thing that we will set up. And by actually creating this network, what we can do is actually like install Wireguard on our smartphone and connect to our local home network using like Wireguard, and then through Pi-hole, meaning we will also get like an ad blocker for our phone, which is pretty useful in my opinion. So the ports that will need to be opened, these are all for local use. So you don't need to open these on your modem. That's not needed. This is purely all for your local computer. And then for the volumes, this is persistent data that you want to store. So in here we need to actually change this to the location within the virtual machine. So if I go back to here, let's close this one out actually, because we don't really no longer need it. So in here we can actually like make a directory called Docker and then Pi-hole, for example. So if we go to Docker and then inside Pi-hole, and then the parent work directory is /root/docker/Pi-hole. So that's what we're going to use. You can of course choose whatever you want here, where you want to store it on the virtual machine. So root docker Pi-hole, and let's then call it etc, for example, since it's etc Pi-hole. So we do by default it will create these directories as well, but then the owner will be, well, Docker, and if you want to keep this your own file, it's recommended that you create these on your own. So let's create it, let's say etc, and create that. And what else? DNS mask, so let's call this just DNS. There we go. So these are also created. So back to Portainer. There, and DNS. And we can also here set the time zone. This is purely for logging, for logs, and then the web password that will be used to actually log into the service itself. We are also then going to create the network as long as it doesn't exist already from Pi-hole. And we are going to give it a subnet and everything so it can actually be used. So here we set the IP of this container, so this will be 172.20.0.2, and I believe like Wireguard in the boilerplate is set up as 3, and then the network itself, so the subnet and whole network is just 172.20.00. Okay, so I'm not going to create this actually here, because, well, this network will probably be detected already because it already exists, because I'm running it with the same IP. So I'll just move over to my own Portainer instance in this case. So let's quickly go there. Portainer. Yes. And for me it's on the network, stacks, Pi-hole, editor. So as you can see here, here it is for me. I've set everything up here. I've given it also like a location for everything to save. So you can then just create, or in this case for me update, but you can just create the stack. This should build without any issues. And then under containers you can see them running over here, and we can actually go to these interfaces. So if you remember the IP address, you can just go there. So what was the IP address here for us? It was 192.168.0.203. It uses a lot of ports here, but, well, these won't be used by Pi-hole. So to actually get to this website, you will actually have to say like 192.168.0. What was it, like 180 whatever, and then the /admin, and that will be the admin panel that we can actually use to log in. So if I log out here quickly, how do I log out? There we go. You'll pretty much see something like this, and then you can just log in and we'll be in here. So this is pretty much used for blocking ads and using as a DNS. Now a few things maybe to set up. Let me quickly check, because there may be a few things that you want to do. Yeah, first of all, you can use your DNS here as well. So we use Pile as a local DNS, but of course Pile needs to connect to the internet to actually serve you websites if you like enter Google or YouTube or something. And then you can here choose which DNS you want to use. So Cloudflare is like 1.1.1.1, I believe. So these are a few things that you can set up here. Is there something else? Not really at the moment, I believe. No. So that's pretty much it. The useful thing now is that you can actually use this IP. So, well, for me it's now no longer an IP, but let's say, where is it? Yeah, so this IP, so 192.168.0.203, we can actually use this as our DNS now. So within your settings of your machine, you can go to your network. Well, I'm using like Linux, so if I go to host desktop, let's see here. Okay, so here at the bottom, these are my settings for my computer, but what I've done is I've set up the name server as the IP of my Pi-hole. So if you're setting up Pi-hole and the IP from the virtual machine was like something like, where was it here? Let's scroll down. 192.168.0.203. You'll just enter that here within your name server. For Windows, I guess it's just the DNS location itself. And that's how you set it up actually. And then it will, every time it runs, it will use the Pile as your local DNS. Okay, yeah, the default gateway of course is pretty much always the same, so you don't really need to change that. But that's pretty much everything. Okay. We're going to also use Pile as a local DNS. So once you've connected to Pile as your name server, we can actually go to the local DNS and then DNS records, and here we can actually go set up where everything needs to go. So I've set up now a pi.lan domain that I can search for. So if I go to pi.lan and press enter, it goes to the dashboard. So I don't really need to remember the IP where it's hosted or on which virtual machine it is actually hosted. So that's pretty useful. So we can just give the domain here and then the IP address. Now if your service, like the Portainer service, if you can remember, where is it? Is it still in there? No. Maybe let's go back to that website again. Here we go. So as you can see, Portainer itself, the dashboard, runs on port 9443. So we can't really do that within Pile. We can't really give an IP, so let's say 192.168.0.5. We can't set like 9443. It won't allow us to do this. So an example is like this, and like press add. Something is wrong. This is not a correct or a valid IP address. So we can't really do that. And for that, we actually need something like the Nginx proxy manager. So that's the full thing that we'll see actually. Okay. So let's close this and this. And from Docker, let's go to Wireguard. There we go. So I've also set something up like this for Wireguard, which is also just a Docker Compose file. And in here we also have something that we can just copy paste actually and place within Portainer. So we can just go to stack again, add a stack, call it Wireguard. In this case I already have it here. And just enter all the information that you need at the bottom here. So there are a few things that you will need to change. So if I zoom in, again, the persistent data. This data is pretty much, as I mentioned before, used for when you are going to actually move all these files to another virtual machine, or you want to get all these backed up locally. These are all the settings that you actually use. So if you have this file, you can always spin up a new container in Docker with, let's say, Wireguard, and it will always be set up the same with this persistent data. So that's pretty useful. Some things you need to change is, first of all, the PUID. So you can find that by actually going to the virtual machine. Yeah. And I believe, what was the command again? So ID U for the user and IDG probably for the group. In this case, both is are 0 because, well, it's the root user. If it's like a username that you already have created, it will probably like 1000 or 1001. But for me, it's just 0 that you will enter. The time zone again. And then we also need actually to add a server URL. So in this case, it will probably be either your domain that you already own, or like your IP address, so your actual public IP address. So what you can do is like serve to something like ipchicken.com, I believe it is. Yes. Press enter. I'm not going to do it because I'm not going to leak my IP address, of course, but that will be your public IP address. And I believe it should work with here just entering your public IP address and then just creating this port. So this is the port that is used by Wireguard itself. Do remember that you need to open this port. So how do we open this port? Well, just go to your modem or your router, depending on where you open your ports to, well, the general public, to the internet itself. In this case, I have like a web interface for my provider. And what I did was, well, I created a link to my local IP address. Well, it's in another language, but I guess you can figure this out actually. So this will send all the requests that come from port 51820. This is the start port and the end port. This is external, so I can change this. I'm not sure if you can do this on every modem, but keep this pretty much the same. You can of course open like more ports here to the same end port internally, but for me it's just sending all the requests from port 51820 to 192.168.0.4, and of course this is the IP address where Wireguard is running, so the virtual machine where Wireguard is running. And if you can also select it, you only need to do this for UDP, so not for TCP or both, just UDP. So that's also quickly how you port forward. Of course, I can't tell you where you can find this. This is sometimes a IP address that you need to search for, like your default gateway or something. But of course, this is something that either your modem or your internet service provider can tell you where to find actually. Okay. Is there something else maybe I need to tell about this? Let's go back to the boilerplate. Yes. So with Wireguard, the neat thing in my opinion is that you can actually only generate certificates for specific devices. So not everyone can actually access. So this port that we've just set up, you might think, oh, now I'm exposed to the whole wide world. not really the case. The only way we can actually access this port and actually use the network, the internal network, is with these pairs. So if I only generate one pair and this pair is used on a specific computer, then no one else can actually connect. As long as they don't get the key itself that is generated, nobody will be actually able to access this port. So yeah, you can either give it a number or you can actually give it a name. In my opinion, names are pretty useful just to remember which certificate or which configuration file is for which device. So that's pretty useful. The DNS you don't really need to change. This is what we've set up with the network already. The pair DNS, you can keep this at auto, but because I've noticed that there are some issues with everything, I do not recommend it. You can just keep it at this, because then we are sure that BIOL is being used actually. The internal subnet, this is pretty straightforward. You can choose whatever you want here, I believe, but I kept it to the default that Wireguard recommends. The allowed IPs, you can always set up like a range for specific IP addresses to be used. When you set it to this, pretty much every device can be connected and accessed. So for me, I know it is pretty safe if you don't share anything with anyone, so I'll just allow everything in my opinion. And that's pretty much all that is to do. Then I do need to check quickly, because once you've set this up and given the correct variables in, you can create the stack again, go to containers, and then from here you can view the logs. And within the logs, it should generate also like a, what's it called, like a QR code. In this case, I can't see it unfortunately. But a QR code is, for example, used if you want to use it with the app from Wireguard. You can then scan it, and that's very easy then to set everything up. But if you want to actually access these things, we can go to like this icon, which is like the terminal or the console. I believe they use bash. Maybe not, maybe sh then just. Okay, that might be an issue then if we can't access it like this. Let me quickly check, because I can't remember all these things on my own actually. That's why I've created like these boilerplates. So within these boilerplates I also have like a readme with the specific things. So let me check. So this is for the installation. Check that static IP and DNS is relevant. Yes. Okay, we can just copy it then in this case. Okay, so let's then go here. Let's go to my virtual machine that is running Wireguard, which is a network. And if I do an ls, as you can see here, I have a directory which is called Wireguard. Let's go in there. And this is where my actual persistent data comes in pretty useful, because if you can see over here in my stack, Wireguard, editor, I have stored my configs under root Wireguard config. So if I go back and I go into config and do another ls, here are my pairs. So I have a pair for my MacBook, one for my phone, and one for my ThinkPad. So what I can now do, let's say I've generated one config in here. Where is it? So here you can see that's these three. I can now actually go in and go into, let's say, pair phone, ls, and then we have here a pair underscore phone.conf and this one can then be shared over the network with your phone, or if you have like a laptop with a ThinkPad, you can use this config, and you can actually use that to actually connect to your local network. So that's pretty useful, in my opinion. Now I did write some other things down here, so you can actually move these. So if you need a bit more information, I'm not going to go into too much detail and not waste too much time, because not everyone will be interested in this. But how to access these files, how to generate the QR code will probably also be in here. Yeah, here. So that's pretty much this command that you can run. So I'm not going to do it because otherwise I'll make my own via a VPN available to everyone on the internet. But you can actually run these commands. One thing to note, as you can see, there are a few notes which are quite important, and I'll show that as well. One thing is actually to enable IPv forwarding via sysctl. So you can just copy this, go to PVE, enter this, press enter, and you're pretty much done. Of course, this is in the container. We also need to do this within Proxmox. So we go to the node, to shell, and do the same as well here, enter, and then pretty much you will have no issues connecting to your local network. Maybe one more thing, let's have a look here. I think if you want to make this persistent, yeah. So to make this persistent, you actually need to enable this within this file. So let's go there. Yeah. So cd. Oh no, that's the file itself. So vim. So there's one thing here that is uncommented, net.ipv4, IPv forwarding equals 1. So this will then always enable this feature even when the computer or the server reboots. So with the command that I've written down here, well, it will work, but after you restart a virtual machine or Proxmox itself, well, you will need to re-enable this. So that's something that we don't want to do. So maybe to make this persistent, enable this within the config file. Of course, with all my boilerplates, have a look at README, because I pretty much explain everything what's in here, what needs to be changed, and then also the usage and the notes. So I'm not going to go into too much more detail about this now. Next up, what else are we going to have a look at? Ah yes, the Nginx proxy manager, which is very useful. So with that, again, there's a boilerplate for Docker, Nginx proxy manager, and this one is probably very easy. Yes, so you don't really need to do anything here. Again, there's a bit of persistent data, as you can see here. Again, just create these within a virtual machine or within a container, and then we can go to that website. I believe that the network, well, the interface for this will be on port 81. So 81 for me adds this one, and I might need to blur a bit here, but we'll see. So once you're logged in, so you'll probably need to like create an account. In this case, I'm already logged in. You will pretty much come here, and we can actually set up like a local DNS. So that's pretty useful. So the first thing we want to do, so let's say with Portainer, what we can do is here add a proxy. So from here we can like give the IP address that we went to go to Portainer. Let's say we want to add Nginx proxy manager to Portainer, and Portainer in this case, let me quickly check here. So Portainer here is on this IP for me. Copy. Let's quickly paste. We can remove this. So that's what pretty useful if we don't want to actually remember the IP address to actually serve to these web interfaces. So the domain name in this case will be anything you want. Whoops. So let's paste the IP address here where it actually belongs. There. And then we need to give the port number. In this case, I am using port 9000. If you're now alarmed that we just set it up with 9443, don't be. This is because I'm using Portainer, like the enterprise version or the business version. For you, if you're using the community edition, of course you don't need to do this. You can change this to 443. But just to make everything work, I'll keep it like this. By default, it uses HTTPS, I believe. Let me quickly check. Before we do, let's quickly check here. Apparently for the enterprise version it doesn't, but if I remember correctly, we did receive an error just a minute ago that we weren't accessing HTTPS. So maybe for you it needs to be HTTPS by default, but I'll keep it for me for this example with HTTP. And then we can give it a name. So let's give this a name of tutorial.lan. So that will be the domain name in this case that we want to access this. You can then also set up a few extra things here. So let's say block common exploits is one, yeah, these all don't really pretty much for me. I only enable this one. You can also create an access list if you want to, but since we are just going to access this locally, you can keep it publicly accessible. This looks good. We don't really need a custom location. I'm also not going to go into too much detail here. And the SSL, we can do that, but I'll show that when we are hosting like an Nginx website actually. So I'm not going to go into too much detail now for that. So this looks good. So tutorial.lan will bring us to our Portainer dashboard. Unfortunately, this will not work at the moment. So let's go to tutorial.lan and nothing happens. So I might want to actually, for the first time, do a /, and this will not find actually the domain itself because it doesn't exist. There isn't like a .lan that doesn't exist. So to actually use this, we can now go here within Pi-hole or Pi-hole and actually add tutorial.lan. And we're not going to use the IP of Portainer. So Portainer was on 192.168.0.4. No, we're actually going to forward this to the location of our Nginx proxy manager. So then afterwards, Nginx proxy manager can actually send us to the correct IP address and correct port we need to access. So Nginx for me now runs on 5, IP 5. So that looks good. Add. And it should be in here somewhere. Here at the end. There we go. So now it should work without any issues, hopefully. It might take a while before it populates, but of course this should work. Do keep in mind that you can't really just use any web address, of course. It tells you here, okay, this is the order it actually picks the correct address. So if you're like going to use a .com website that already exists, this won't of course work. It will just send you to the correct online network website in this case. But for .lan it won't give any issues. So if I now reload, try again, it actually loads us into the website and we can now log in. And it doesn't remember my login, so I can't really log in. But that's how we actually do our local DNS. So that's pretty straightforward in my opinion. Nothing fancy actually for this. Many people struggle with this, but this is, in my opinion, one of the easier things to set up, especially with Pi-hole, of course. Okay, what's the next thing? Nextcloud. Okay, so again, to the boilerplates. Docker. And Nextcloud is here. So Nextcloud is pretty much used for our storage. So we've set up storage, of course, as you can see here. We have created a data folder where we can store all our data on, and we are going to use this data from TrueNAS within Nextcloud. Maybe now we're here. Let's quickly check if all true charts actually work, because that took a while. Yes, so as you can see, if you're still here, since the TrueNAS installation, it actually populated all the other services here. So if you don't want to actually follow along no longer, or you think it's a bit too hard for you, you can always just set all these things up within here as well. So I think they probably also have a Nextcloud in here. Let's see, Nextcloud. Yes, it's even one that is official. So yeah, I'll keep you with it, depending if you want to choose it from here and install it, but we'll keep going with the boilerplates. So for now, I am actually going to use the official one, I believe. It's a bit more straightforward. Docker compose. We'll copy everything here. And in this example, I'm actually also using a few labels for traffic. These can pretty much be removed. So these are if you're actually going to use something like traffic as a reverse proxy. If you see one of my boilerplates with labels, do check and make sure it's not anything for traffic if you're not using it, of course. But I pretty much explained this as well in the README, I think. Yes, you can see here. So these are all for traffic, so you can safely remove these. And within this Docker container for Nextcloud, we run a few services. So we run, first of all, Nextcloud, but we also run Redis and MariaDB. This is pretty useful as a database, but do check that you fill in all these variables and that they actually are correct. So here with MySQL or MySQL, how you want to pronounce it, doesn't really matter. These need to be pretty much the same as here. So the root password, the normal password, and the database that you set here should be the same. Otherwise, of course, there will be a lot of issues. And for this, if you want to run it, of course, as a on your local network, do not forget to actually open these ports. If you're actually going to use something like your own domain that you own, you don't really need to open these ports, I believe. Or maybe you do. I think that with traffic, you don't really need to. It will find these ports. But with Nginx Proxy Manager, it can't hurt, of course, to enable these. Okay, so next up. Once you've copied this over, of course, we can go to Portainer. Let's go to my instance within cloud, stack, Nextcloud, editor. So as you can see, this is the one that I've set up. Yeah, the password, very hard. But of course, no one accesses this. But if you set everything up correctly here, it should all work as one thing. You don't need to set anything up with settings within Redis or with MariaDB. These are pretty much all set up, so they should work in conjunction with each other. So you don't need to do anything special here, actually. Once this is set up, you can go to containers, and it will actually create a separate container for all of these. So one for Nextcloud, one for MariaDB, and one for Redis. So these are all running without any issues. And then again, if you want to, you can set up like a local domain name for this. So I'll just quickly go to mine. There we go. So this is pretty much where you will just serve to the IP address and then port. What was it? If you set up a port, well, it depends. You can keep it 80, so you can just go to the IP address, or set it up as 8080 and then just visit that website. So for people who don't really understand this, if we have a port enabled for the Docker compose file, the left side is actually the outside, so what is running in your virtual machine, and the port on the right side is what is running inside the Docker compose, the Docker container. So here we have /var/www/html. That's inside the Docker, And then on the left, that's our persistent data that we can of course access within the virtual machine. And this is just the same for ports. So left is the port in our virtual machine, and on the right is the port on Docker. So you can actually change this port to whatever you want here on the left actually. Okay, so once you've filled everything in, created your database and registered your user, maybe we'll just now quickly enable how you can actually use the data or the data pool that is available with the hard drives that we've connected with TrueNAS. So that's data. How do we do this? Well, we go to apps, I believe. And then from here we can click the search or the thing here. It's slipping out of my mind the name of it, the magnifying glass. And we can search for external storage, I believe it is called. And this will, for you, be not enabled, so you can just enable this. And then from here we can go at the top again to settings. And if your user is a administrator, we can go to external storage. And then from here we can actually add the storage itself. So how do we do this? Well, we are going to of course use local and then give here the path to the data. Now if you have a look at my, where is it? Nextcloud. My /data is mounted to MNT storage. So this is something that doesn't exist. So MNT storage is a map, is a directory that did not exist within my virtual machine. So what does that mean? Have a look here. Cloud. Let's go to cd MNT storage. And I do an ls. Here are all my files that are actually on my server, on my TrueNAS data pool. Now how do I get them on here? Because well, this shouldn't be on there. This should be on my virtual machine from TrueNAS. Well, I'll explain that in a minute. But do create already a location where you plan on adding these files to well, the virtual machine that is running Nextcloud, of course. So just create this directory already before setting everything up. Let's say we have like a data2 or something. We can give it a specific owner in this case, and then we can just press save and it will actually load all the files in here. Now to actually access the files from TrueNAS, what we will need to do is go to the virtual machine and we need to edit etc/fstab. So this is where we are going to mount our storage locations. So in this case, we had like a 192.168.122.85. So that's the IP address from TrueNAS. And our SMB share was called data, so /data. In my example here, it is another IP, but it's pretty much the same. So it's //192.168.0.3. If we were following the same example, it would be 122.85 / the name of the SMB share that is available. And then we actually do a space and then the location where everything will be mounted to automatically. So in this case, the map that we created, so MNT storage. And this MNT storage then is used here within Portainer, within our stack, MNT storage, to actually link to inside our Docker container to /data. Now /data also didn't exist in the beginning with Nextcloud, but it all creates this by default without you having to interfere with anything with this stack or this Docker compose file in this case. Now, a few things that you need to add here, of course, within the etc/fstep file is, of course, it's a CIF or CIFS, also known as an SMB share. Then we need to give the username and the password, and this password I might have to blur actually. And for the UID, we need to actually find the UID from Docker in this case, because, well, if we are going to set this to a UID from ourselves, so either 1000 or 0, there is a possibility that Docker won't be able to see this directory just because of the permissions issues. And then a few other things here is, of course, underscore netdev and no fail. This is just a few other parameters that we need to enable just so that everything can boot even when the SMB share is not available. And then space 0 space 0. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but just keep that the same as well. Okay. And once you've done this, you can always just right quit and say mount -a, or just restart the virtual machine, and then everything should be mounted and you will be able to actually add files to this. Next up. So once you've added that here, so in my example, I just called the folder a specific name, so files, for example. We can keep this to local and then use data here. Depending on what, depending on which version you use of Nextcloud, or if you're using it within like TrueNAS or something, there might be also another option here called SMB/CIFS, and then you don't have to do everything within the virtual machine. You can just enter like the IP address of the SMB with the name of the SMB, of course. Okay, so that's pretty fine. So here it mentions there as well, so that it is not possible for this version in my situation actually. So once this is done, you can just go to Files. And then here will then be a folder created, in this case called Files. And in here are all my documents that actually are stored on my TrueNAS installation with my data pool and everything. So that can be accessed here. Okay. Yeah, one more thing before I forget, because of course now you can actually store all your data on here, but you can't edit them. Yeah, so with my PowerPoint, so the homelab.pptx, I won't be able to actually access them, access this by default. So if I click on this, it will actually open OnlyOffice, which is pretty useful in my opinion, to actually edit these things within, well, a browser. So it's pretty much the same as OneDrive or Google Drive. So that's very neat in my opinion. Now, how do we do this? Well, quickly go to boilerplates again, Docker, and you can either choose in this case to use Collabora or OnlyOffice. This is what you prefer on your own. I do also believe, where is it? Let's go here to apps. And if I search for Nextcloud Office, yeah, so that's an option here that we can enable or disable or download. I think if we go to apps and then to Office and text, yeah, so in this case it's not Collabora Office, but it's called Collabora Online. So this is pretty much used for if you don't want to actually install like a container. So this will all run within Nextcloud. Now, do keep in mind, this is not something that works very well in my opinion. So I've tried to use this, but every time I do, everything becomes very slow and isn't very responsive. So I personally do not recommend that you actually set this up, but you always can try and have a look. Maybe for you it does, but recently it didn't really work for me. So, but if you enable the Collabora Online built-in code server, I do also believe that you need to enable Nextcloud Office. Yeah, so that's this one. So it's kind of the same, but you also need to enable this as well. If you're going to use OnlyOffice, you don't need to do this actually, but you do need to go to the OnlyOffice application and actually install this. So this will create the connector that can actually connect to your self-hosted server instance of OnlyOffice. So let's do it with OnlyOffice then, shall we? So OnlyOffice, go to the Docker Compose file, and this one is again very easy to set up, as you can see. So it's very small. You can again just go to Portainer, stack, create a new stack and run it. Of course, do check that you're not having overlapping ports, otherwise you need to change like the left one to a new port, or yeah, or run it in another virtual machine with another IP. Of course, that's also an alternative. Now to add this, so let's say you've added this, you created the stack, you are running it, and it should all be fine. What we can do is go back to Nextcloud, go to settings, and then there's an option under administration OnlyOffice. And if it wouldn't fill that in, that would be great. Let me just quickly disable this. Settings. I need to blur maybe some of these things now, but we'll have a look. Yeah, reload. So in my case, I have created like a domain, a local. In this case, it's actually accessible over the internet, but you can just give here your either local LAN, if of course this container is using the same name server, so from Pi-hole, or you just give the IP address here that connects to the OnlyOffice location. So this is for me. I'm going to partially blur this, of course, because, well, this is actually available online. I don't want other people to make use of this. And then after this is validated, you can just select here what you actually want to allow, how you want to use it. Yeah, that's pretty much everything here. Do keep in mind, if you are going to run these instances, do check that they are the same level of security. So if your Nextcloud instance is running under HTTP, your OnlyOffice can of course run under HTTP. If your Nextcloud is running under HTTPS, for example, when you're using your own domain, and it is automatically validating it and sending it to HTTPS, your OnlyOffice link here should also be encrypted. If this is not the case, you won't be allowed to actually connect because it's not a secure connection. So that's something to keep in mind. But after you've connected, you will either get an error that tells you, okay, it's not the same security certification, or it tells you, okay, it is connected, of course. And you'll actually see this being updated, the common settings, so you can actually change these things then. Okay, that's pretty much it for Nextcloud. Yeah, so once this is set up, you can just go to files, and then when you press on the plus, you actually have a lot more options. So by default, it only has like upload files, new folder, and a new text file. But with OnlyOffice, you also get a new document, spreadsheet, presentation, and form template. So that's pretty useful to actually have within Nextcloud itself. Then last but not least, running an Nginx website in this case. So for that, what I have done is within my Proxmox instance, I've created a virtual machine for website. And in this case, I have installed just a Debian. Let's see, is it still mounted? No. But I've used like a Debian container for this, and then I've installed Nginx, I believe, or it was already installed by default, if I'm not mistaken. So you can just go to, where is it, local templates, Debian 11, for example. That's a great one in my opinion. And when you install it by creating a container, we can go to, where was it again? I think it was var www/html. Just do an ls, and in here we actually have, well, these are the files for my website, but this is where you are going to place your files for your website, so the index.html and so on. And then normally, if I have a look at my Nginx proxy and go to my website, edit, it should indeed just run on port 80. So you can just serve to the IP address from your what's it called? Your virtual machine, so IP 8. In this case for me it is 192.168.0.6. Of course you can always make this static to make it easier to remember. And then when you serve to this, it should go to your website. So let me copy this, paste, and this of course loads my website, and all should work without any issues. Okay, so once you've done that, so you don't even need to use Docker for this. So in this case I'm also not using Docker. You can of course if you want to, but since this is a service that is running by default on Debian, I use it like this. If it's not running yet, you can always do something like systemctl start nginx, or if you always want to enable it, you can say systemctl enable nginx, and this will actually always start it up when the virtual machine starts up. So yeah. Now next up, to make this website available again to the whole wide world, one thing you need to do is actually make use of the Nginx proxy manager again. So what I've done here is I have the IP address from my virtual machine that is running Nginx with my website on it. I have the port, which is just 80, and by default it goes to HTTP, of course. Then I've given here a few domain names where it needs to redirect to, and these domain names need to actually be yours, of course, otherwise this won't work. And I also block, of course, the common exploits, and I use an SSL. So SSL is for the HTTPS. So if I go to my website, it will always be actually like encrypted and safe to visit. So people won't get like these warning signs, like when you first open up your Portainer instance or your Proxmox instance, you get these warnings. So that's why I have a SSL. And for this I use Cloudflare, because they make it very easy, in my opinion, to set everything up. So let me close all these things because we no longer need them. Portainer also not. Nope. Okay. And Nginx. So I force, of course, the SSL. And then the certificate here, we do need to generate still. So how do we do this? Well, first of all, I'm not going to explain, of course, how to create a whole website, but of course, make sure that the DNS, so the hosting of it, goes through Cloudflare. So you can always just generate like you can always create a account. Once you're logged in, you can add your website. In this case, give your domain name, add the site. Cloudflare will then give you like the name servers that will be used. So if you are not purchasing your domain name from Cloudflare, you need to of course go to your what's it called again? For me it's epic.com, your registrar, and if I go there, hopefully I don't need to blur too much here. That's something I already need to blur. Great. So if I go to my website here and I go to my name servers, as you can see, I had to change these because normally these go through Epic as well for me, but I had to change these to the name servers from Cloudflare. And then I can afterwards manage my website through Cloudflare. So I can click on it. There we go. And the thing you need to do is for Nginx, we are going to create an SSL certificate. This is how we are going to request it, of course. And create a Let's Encrypt certificate. And the domain name, of course, you need to give here. So for me, it is binats.com and just a wildcard.binats.com. And then, so let's just use a dummy in this case, .com. You give it an email address. This email address will be used for Let's Encrypt to actually send you email messages with updates from terms of service and when your certificate will be invalid. So after a while it will be invalid and you need to actually request a new one. But in this case we are first going to use a DNS challenge because this is what Cloudflare uses. So let's use Cloudflare. Of course you don't need to use Cloudflare if you have another provider. As you can see, there are a lot of providers here. So Cloudflare, and they actually ask you for an API token in this case. So go back to Cloudflare and then scroll down on your overview panel. I need to blur this again. And then here we can get your API token. So I press on that, and I believe you can just use the global API token, but for what I used is I just created a wildcard token. And as you can see, if I edit this one, so you can just click create token and it'll come to this menu. You can give it a name, and in this case just change the permissions to zone DNS edit and then include all zones. So that's for all the zones, so for your normal domain name and all the wildcards in front of it. And then we can just continue to summary and it will actually give you an API token, and this API token can then be used over here. Just remove this one and add whatever is needed here. Doesn't really matter. Propagation seconds, leave empty. Yeah, we can just leave this empty. We can accept, of course, the terms and service, and this will then load up a new certificate. Now, to actually make us able, or anyone on the internet able, to actually connect to this now, because we are linking this, we do actually also need to set up within Cloudflare that we send all this traffic to our host, so to our server. And to do this, we can go back to websites, to my website, and to DNS. And we can actually here then create our records. So in this case, as you can see, I'll just blur the IP address, but we need to first create a, well, this one will be by default here, I think. So my domain name, and then the wildcard is just a star and on your IP address, and then the rest here. Ah yes, and something I forgot to mention actually. When you're generating this this certificate, it is maybe recommended that you temporarily disable proxied for these IP addresses. Otherwise, it might not actually be able to connect to this. So yeah, so that's very important. And so you can just add like a wildcard, your own domain, and maybe also www, because pretty much that's also a wildcard. And for me, I also just proxy them all over. Also, because these will be using port 80 and 443 to actually connect to your website, this is something also you need to go port forward on your modem. So in this case, for me, as you can see here, port 80 will be sent to 192.168.0.5, and also port 443 also for TCP also will be sent to the same proxy manager. And this so the 80 is for HTTP, so not encrypted, not safe, and 443 is for, of course, the encrypted website connections. Within here, maybe also something else you can enable just to make sure that you always have like SSL. What is it again? Ah yes, here under SSL, TLS, you can actually where is it? Yes, yeah, on the Edge certificates. Yeah, here you can actually also just generate certificates if you want to, but you can also enable always use HTTPS, so the website connection is always secure, so whenever anyone tries to access your website, it will always be HTTPS. Hopefully I didn't forget anything here. I don't think so. Automatic HTTP rewrite is maybe also useful, so when someone actually looks for your website with HTTP, it will automatically redirect to HTTPS. So that's all things that we don't need to actually manage with the Nginx proxy manager, so that's something very useful. Now do keep in mind, if you are planning on running some of your services also over the network, so let's say you have a domain, but not only you want to use your website for this, but you also want to actually let's say run a Plex media server, or use something like Fault Warden as I'm using, then you also need a domain. Let's say you want to actually lock this down even more securely. What you can do with an Nginx proxy manager is actually create a access list. So if I add an access list, I can here then give it a name, probably enable satisfy any, and then under authorization I can actually enable the to add a username and a password. So whenever someone wants to access like your Plex server, they first need to use a different username and a different password actually to get access to it. So this is pretty useful. The access IP settings, it is useful if you're using it locally, but since we are using, well, Cloudflare with proxy, well, with the connection being proxied, you don't really know what the IP actually is that is being used to connect to this, so that's not really useful in my opinion. But for local use, this is also a great rule, but I think most people will just use a username and a password actually. And once this new access rule is created, so I have one for auth, I call it, so two-factor auth. What you can do is then go to your host, proxy host. Let's say this one, it's disabled, so it doesn't really matter. I can click on enable. Oh no, not enable. I can click on edit, and then on the access list, I can actually use the auth list. And if I now want to use the SSL certificate that I've generated, I can go to SSL. And then here I can select the one that is available. So in this case, this is the one I've generated, and it tells me when it's going to expire, so I know when to actually regenerate it. I can also request a new SSL certificate. So since the API is still linked, I can now easily create one from here. And if I don't want one, I can also just select that as well. Is there something else I need to mention? Let's see. I'm not going to go into the advanced rules. That's a bit too much in my opinion. No, that's pretty much it, I believe. Did I do everything? Yeah. So that's pretty much everything that. Well, I use a lot more services, of course. If you can have a look at my boilerplates again. Here. As you can see, I run a lot more services at home. But these are, in my opinion, pretty essential. So have a look at what you need, what your needs are, what you actually want to use. I have, of course, a README for all of these. So if you don't know what they are, it tells you very quickly what it actually is. With Nextcloud also, so that's pretty useful. Yeah. So hopefully it is all clear. Of course, I didn't really have a script for this. This is all just, yeah. I just created like a PowerPoint for 3 slides, and that was pretty much my preparation. So if you have any questions, do let me know in the comments. I hope that you have a general idea now how you can set everything up and get everything working. Of course, I do need to mention with VPNs and with these IP addresses and your your own registrar and your name servers, this can be finicky. So especially if you are using another one, do of course your own research. Don't ask me everything. I don't of course know everything, but I do wish you all the best of luck with it, and yeah, maybe I'll see you all in a new mini course in the future. Thanks.